This is Wellness by Designs, and I'm your host, Andrew Whitfield Cook. And joining us again today is Stephen Judge, a naturopath and nutritionist who specialises in complex chronic gut issues. Today, we're going to be speaking about metabolic endotoxemia. All diseases have a gut component. Welcome back to Wellness by Design, Stephen. How are you?
Thanks, Andrew. I'm great. Thanks for having me again.
Absolute pleasure. And thank you so much for joining us today. So I think we start off with what is metabolic endotoxemia and where is it applicable?
Yeah, sure. So before defining that, I guess to provide the context as a reminder, what is this concept of so-called leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability, right? So
Yes.
the intestinal barrier wall is a gatekeeper, right? So in a healthy person, in a physiologically healthy gut, this barrier should selectively be allowing macro and micronutrients and water through the gut wall and into our bloodstreams so that these components can be sent to the organs and tissues that need them. So we could say that the lining of our gut wall should be selectively permeable, right? So it should only be letting through what needs to go through, and it should not be letting anything through that shouldn't be found in circulation, right? So microbial toxins, bacteria, metabolic waste, etc. And the structure of the intestinal barrier wall is like this three-layered membrane, right? So the first layer is the single-celled, semi-permeable layer of epithelial cells held together by tight junctions. On top of this is a double layer of mucus on top of these cells, and the gut bacteria reside on top of that mucus layer. Due to various factors, what can happen is the tight junctions between those epithelial cells on the first layer can degrade, gaps can form in the lining of this wall, subsequently increase the barrier's permeability, leading to what we call intestinal hyperpermeability, aka leaky gut. So the loss of integrity in the health of this barrier, aka leaky gut, has been suggested for decades, if not longer, to supposedly lead to or be a contributing factor to a variety of symptoms and conditions, like not just digestive, but metabolic and neurological and autoimmune and all these things. And what the research on this area called metabolic endotoxemia is highlighting is that it appears that, okay, it looks like everything really does start in the gut or is driven by a leaky gut, so to speak. And the mechanisms of metabolic endotoxemia explains this very well at a very specific kind of biochemical level. And yeah, the research is confirming there's a lot of truth to the concept of a so-called leaky gut, which is amazing because considering the wisdom of ancient traditions have held this perspective for centuries, right? Like in Ayurveda, they've always taught that the Agni or digestive fire is the key to optimal health. In TCM, spleen and stomach chi are fundamental to overall health, and they are a fundamental component of the digestive system. And Hippocrates said that death sits in our bowels, and Henry Lindlar said that, the accumulated morbid matter and systemic poisons that are reabsorbed are what drives disease. So yeah, it's kind of cool that this field of research on metabolic endotoxemia is starting to confirm all this, right? So with all that, right, so with endotoxemia, the simple definition of it, which I'll expand upon, is a condition where there are excessive levels of something called LPS, short for lipopolysaccharide, in the bloodstream. And so the term endotoxin, which is what LPS is referred to, it comes from the Greek word endo, meaning within, because LPS is a molecule found within the outer membrane of specifically gram-negative bacteria. It's what differentiates gram-negative bacteria from gram-positive bacteria. It is this LPS that is housed within the outer membrane. And, LPS inherently shouldn't be an issue. And, while a healthy gut wall can handle a small amount of LPS getting into circulation, and be appropriately handled by the liver to be cleared from the body, this LPS endotoxin should not be getting through that gut wall in large amounts. If excessive levels of LPS do get into systemic circulation due to the gut being too permeable, this essentially triggers the innate immune system, leading to this chronic low-grade subclinical inflammation. And as we know, the chronic inflammatory state is increasingly recognized as a key driver of most chronic diseases. So we have to step back and go, okay, well, what's driving chronic inflammation in all of these chronic diseases? And we are repeatedly being brought back to the gut, and specifically this endotoxemic mechanism is a very common explanation linking all these conditions together. So, we're essentially looking at the downstream effect of specific types of dysbiosis or bacterial imbalances and a hyperpermeable gut wall. So if someone has LPS producing bacteria dominating their microbiome and their gut wall becomes too permeable, this is essentially going to lead to metabolic endotoxemia. And so the excessive LPS endotoxin in the bloodstream, it triggers the innate immune system in some very specific ways, which we'll get into. Because the immune and kind of subsequent inflammatory chemicals that are triggered as a result of this can interact with and impact such a wide variety of tissues and organs in the body, which is why so many conditions are being linked back to endotoxemia, which is so interesting. And so the term metabolic endotoxemia is simply a term researchers came up with to describe when this excessive LPS in the bloodstream was observed to directly kind of be the beginnings of metabolic disorders, such as insulin resistance and obesity and that kind of thing.
So there's so many questions floating around about LPS. Firstly, let's talk about that quote unquote leaky gut. So first things first, it was Brad Leach who basically helped to dismantle that syndrome issue. There's no leaky gut syndrome. It's not a syndrome.
Yeah.
That's kind of like saying there's a pain syndrome or a breathing syndrome. But there is leaky gut and there is excessive leaky gut. But it's not a defined syndrome, if you like. So thank you, Brad, for doing that. And I've watched Brad's career blossom over the years, which is great to see. One of my questions, though, is that kids and the elderly have naturally more leaky guts, even leaky brains. How does this tie into function versus dysfunction?
Yes, love your work, Brad. And I agree, I'm very careful with clients, when discussing these topics of leaky gut, gut dysbiosis, SIBO, etc. I don't like to refer to them as conditions or diseases, so to speak. Even though when you read about things like metabolic endotoxemia in the research, it gets referred to as like a condition, so to speak. But the danger there with, particularly with clients who are desperately looking for a reason for why they're so unwell and what's kind of the quote unquote root cause of their illness. I'm very careful with my language these days to make sure people understand that, leaky gut is certainly not a syndrome or a condition. It's just something that it is the downstream effect of a variety of upstream contributing root causes. I'm very careful I say, look, leaky gut, sure, it's become a contributing factor to perpetuating a disease related to chronic inflammation, but I wouldn't say it's the root cause, because what can happen is people can become a bit too reductionist about it. and they're just looking for the next antimicrobial protocol and the next probiotic. And it's not to say those interventions are not useful and helpful, but it's like 1/10 of the picture, you know. So while it is helpful to get reductionist about it and get into the mechanics of it, at the end of the day, to address all this, you kind of actually just have to zoom out and address someone's overall health, really, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it was Dr. Mick Lyon who saliently pointed it out about this kill mentality. And he said what happens, particularly with extremely sick people, chronic fatigue people, multiple chemical sensitivity, etc., is you kill everything off in the gut and they've got nothing. So they become what's called the mashed potato and peas brigade, and they end up cycling at a lower ebb. They never revitalise their system. So I love what you say about we've got to dig down or, you know, to the root causes. So let's start with those causes. Stress, anyone?
Yeah. And to your point, like, for example, just recently, you know, very recently in the past number of years, you know, there's a lot of awareness around, you know, one of the conditions, the new study came out just a few weeks ago, I think, on an LPS producing bacterial overgrowth being commonly associated in women with endometriosis. Okay, cool. Is another study looking at this LPS endotoxemic link with endometriosis. But then what I see, and you know, this is just in the online world, but like what I see from the general public and even some practitioners, you know, following from that, which is like, cool, there's this research here confirming this link with endotoxemia. But then what can happen is people go, okay, cool. The solution, therefore, is going to be, how do we kill this bacteria? What are all the things to get this bacteria? Like, it becomes this very almost like conventional medical black and white germ theory kind of discussion. It's like, look, it's absolutely wonderful. There's another link kind of, you know, proving this endotoxemia and its relationship to perpetuating endometriosis. But again, it's like the dealing with the bacterial overgrowth is just one piece of this puzzle. You know, it's almost like a damage control kind of style of treatment. Cool, we want to get on top of that, but like in the longer term, to get on top of this and educate people about how to, you know, truly reverse LPS, kind of endotoxemia and leaky gut, we have to zoom out and go, cool, but what led to that type of bacterial overgrowth, right? And to your point, yes, stress, nervous system dysregulation, circadian rhythm disruption, and poor sleep. It was huge. Like, a bit more longer term to consider and address, but like toxicant exposures, the amount of environmental toxicants and medications people are being exposed to, which, you know, are perpetuating this on a deeper level long term, is huge. Yeah, there's so much to consider, so to speak. But that doesn't
So
mean,
much.
at least in the short term, we can get very hyper focused on the gut environment and begin to reduce that LPS load. That's still important, like particularly at the beginning, to start getting that chronic inflammation down.
Just a point you made, that dysbiosis and endometriosis paper, that wouldn't have been written by Justin Sinclair, would it? I think he's done a paper on it.
Like a
I
week
think
ago.
he has.
Oh, really? Cool.
And I also take your point. There was an author, one of my favourite microbiota authors, Catherine Lozapone, who years ago now, and she used the analogy of a garden and things like that, which, you know, some people don't. But in there, she spoke about, now she mentioned the American spelling, acetaminophen, which in Australia is paracetamol, and paracetamol overuse leading to increased amounts of p-cresol, which is a metabolic byproduct which is one of the byproducts which can affect heart function, particularly in those people with kidney disease when they can't get rid of it. It's just amazing. So you're talking about this whole, it's not just there in the gut, it's the gut, things that affect the gut, and then the gut obviously flows out into the rest of the body, has to be handled by other tissues, not just the liver, but the kidneys, etc.
Yeah.
So you really have to treat the patient in a holistic manner.
Yeah, and like I love to explain to clients that if you look at the etymology of the word dysbiosis, it's a Greek word that means wrong living. So it's like yes, it's dysbiosis is the manifestation, or again the downstream effect of many different things that due to an accumulation of those things over a lifetime, right? I know some people have this kind of there's typically like a catalyst of an event that started everything, so to speak, like an antibiotic or gastro or something. But I don't know. I kind of feel like that's usually the straw on the camel's back, so to speak. But yeah, again, it's just I really, really. It can take if people have never thought about it like this. It can take them a while to kind of get it, but it's just cause and effect. Like yeah, dysbiosis is perpetuating and has now been left untreated for so long, it's led to a state of a permeable gut and endotoxemia. But there were things contributing to that dysbiosis over time.
You are so insightful, Stephen. I've got to say, even the word dysbiosis, wrong living, we think wrong living of the bacteria within us. It's our wrong living that's caused this.
Yeah, and
So poignant.
yeah, I mean, when I first heard that, I went, wow, but that wasn't even explained to me in my training. I just said, oh, well, bacteria become imbalanced and it's just something that happens and blah, blah, blah. When you look more deeply into, because, again, like the conventional medical model is very germ phobic, let's say, like very hardcore germ phobic. And, the opposite of dysbiosis is symbiosis. So we should be living with these organisms. We should not be afraid of them and phobic of them. And they're always, even if they're quote unquote imbalanced, they're always trying to serve us. So, I think, again, there's this kind of, in terms of supporting people who've got intense degrees of a permeable gut and LPS getting into their bloodstream and driving endotoxemia. Like, yes, we want to, as quickly as possible, reduce that endotoxic load and heal and seal that gut and reduce the populations of certain organisms in the gut that are perpetuating that, but not in this, kind of black and white warfare mentality of, oh, just got to destroy all the bacteria. We have to really step back and try and get people to understand, cool, but like, why did this happen in the first place? And that's, there's a lot to unpack there over time. Yeah.
So I guess much of your treatment phase, if you like, must be psychology, teaching people how to address the psychology that's affecting their stress, that's affecting their physical aspects.
Yeah, that has become pretty huge for me. Like, people booking in predominantly for help with the gut issue. And I don't know, but I think a lot of people are expecting a prescription of all this kind of what I would call gut-centric supplements, probiotics and prebiotics and, all the supplements for their gut, quote unquote. But I rarely actually do. Like when I first meet people and usually send them off for some testing. In the meantime, I'll usually whack them on some PHGG. But outside of that, I'm pretty much just supporting their nervous system and their stress and their sleep, because that is one of the major contributing factors to dysbiosis and leaky gut and why these imbalances are showing up in the first place. And, the gut just won't heal, so to speak, in a state of nervous system dysregulation. So I am, hugely focused on that from the get-go.
Can I ask, Stephen, what sort of assessments do you favour to check leaky gut? And I've got a second part to this question, sort of, and that is what you mentioned before about working first on these areas that affect the endotoxemia or the leaky gut. And yet people very often want a quick, not bang for buck, but a quick effect. So how do you balance the longer term issues with getting them feeling a little bit different? And I think that the term is different, not necessarily all well. As long as they can feel a change. Do you find that, or do they need to feel well now?
Yeah, look, I guess that's, as a clinician, like, we obviously have this overarching theme of we want to treat the underlying causes, right? But, some people are in significant pain and distress, and we absolutely want to give them symptom relief too, right? It's a bit of both. So, when I first meet people and, we're discussing testing, if we are getting testing while we're waiting for that testing, like I said, we do want some symptom relief. And so, if appropriate, I try not to impose strict elimination diets on people unless they're pretty debilitated with symptoms, and I see a need for them to establish a bit of a baseline. Like, we need to calm all of your symptoms down to establish a baseline of, what it can feel like how is your body functioning when you remove the variable of all these foods coming in and perpetuating your symptoms, so that people aren't just chasing the next supplement when, because of their state of chronic inflammation and leaky gut, their diet is unfortunately making them very symptomatic. So look, I will get into the elimination style diet area if appropriate. But some people, just based on what else might be going on, I may not see a need to take them that far, and I will just, give them some supplements to improve their sleep, and support their nervous system, or some, just some herbal medicines to improve their gut function, like bitters or liver support. It's kind of dependent on the person. But while I'm trying to get them some symptom relief and give them some foundational support at the beginning, with the testing question, look, on paper, so there's two areas to this, right? It's like, if you have a dysbiotic gut with a dominance of LPS producing bacteria combined with a very leaky gut wall, that is going to lead to significant endotoxemia. So, on paper, it's like, okay, well, to see if someone truly does have a leaky gut, I'd go to the lactulose mannitol test. Now, in clinical reality, just to save people some time and money, if we need to prioritize testing, I will go with microbiome testing as a big priority. Just because I say to them, look, whether or not it turns out you truly have a very permeable gut wall, all the style of treatments we need to do anyway are going to treat a leaky gut. It's going to improve that. So I'm happy to safely assume, because it's not going to change what I need to do for you to begin with. If you want to check, cool, we can check. But at a minimum, let's check that in 6 months. Make sure it's, actually gone, so to speak. And so the reason I want to prioritize the microbiome testing is like, cool, if our treatment's going to take care of a leaky gut anyway, I'd rather see what the entire microbial environment looks like and what your type of dysbiosis is, so to speak. Are there significant LPS bacterial overgrowths and or hydrogen sulfide overgrowths? So I'd rather have the information that will help direct their treatment, if that makes sense. But if people want all the data, cool, we'll get it all. And, I'm always, outside of gut testing, I'm, again, zooming out and looking at someone's overall health. So I'm always getting the appropriate pathology done, so to speak. And, because again, well, what contributes to dysbiosis and leaky gut? Well, nutritional deficiencies and, maybe some undiagnosed conditions that haven't been found, like Gilbert syndrome and all that kind of thing. But that's generally my approach with testing.
Yeah. You've just turned what I used to do on its head. I used to favor the lactulose mannitol test, and I totally get you. I totally get you. So I used to favor the lactulose mannitol test because of it's relatively inexpensive versus the microbiome testing. But I totally understand what you're saying. So thank you for that. That's great. That's actually really good. Gives you a lot more information about what's going on, because the other stuff's going to improve the lactulose mannitol test anyway. So it's like,
Yeah, because I know it's like test, don't guess, quote unquote. It's like, but again, it's not going to change my treatment too dramatically, at least to begin with. Let's just get into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it. So can we dive into a few conditions at all? You mentioned, for instance, your metabolic, neuro, autoimmune. Can we start with those? I know that this is more than a broad brushstroke, but can we start with maybe those sorts of types of conditions, patients that come and see you with those?
For sure. So I guess to preface that, what I'll just briefly explain is like what happens once the LPS endotoxin is in circulation in excessive amounts. Because this is
Oh, okay,
honestly, when
yeah,
you
yeah.
understand this, it's like, okay, well, how does how does PCOS, how does insulin resistance relate to metabolic endotoxemia? It's like the same pathway. It's the same chain of events, and then will just manifest in a different way depending on the person. So if LPS endotoxin is in the circulation in excessive amounts, there's this very specific cascade of events where, and this can get super dry and complicated, but if people want to, there's this awesome paper, 2021 paper in Frontiers of Immunology called The Role of Metabolic Endotoxemia in Systemic Inflammation. You know, that's the paper you'd give to anyone, especially like especially a healthcare practitioner who's like still living under a rock and is skeptical about all this. That explains it so well. But essentially, LPS gets in the bloodstream and binds to something called LBP. There's this LPS LBP complex. It attracts the attention of CD14, so protein made of macrophages. It's part of the innate immune response, and so the LPS LBP complex gets transferred by CD14 to something called toll-like receptor 4. So when you start looking at all the research on metabolic endotoxemia and what's going on with endotoxemia and endotoxemia and Parkinson's, it talks about many things, but particularly this TLR4. So with toll-like receptors, they are the principal inducers of innate immunity. And it's why sometimes you'll see, what is endotoxemia? They define it as a chronic state of innate immune activation due to toll receptor activation. Because the job of toll receptors is to detect the presence of microbes in circulation, all their components. And so different types of TLR receptors are responsible for detecting specific types of microbes and components. TLR4's job is to recognize LPS. And so when it finds LPS in circulation, it binds to this, and there is this subsequent release of a myriad of inflammatory cytokines. So TLR4 activation activates NFKB, which then leads to production of, TNFA, interleukin-1, interleukin-6, etc. So, a cool way to think about it is like TLR4 detection of microbial components is considered the first line of defense against bacteria. The most extreme example of this being sepsis, right? It's the same thing. It's just a much more end stage version of endotoxemia if it gets bad enough. So when bacteria translocate into the gut and it overwhelms our immune system to the point that the inflammatory cytokines triggered by TLR4 lead to tissue damage and organ failure, right? So I think I was reading in that paper that, the LPS levels observed in sepsis are about 15 times higher than those seen in individuals with what we call metabolic endotoxemia, this lower grade endotoxemia.
Wow.
But it's the same thing happening on a lower grade subclinical level. But obviously people aren't, having organ failure. But it's the same
Wow.
mechanism in pathway.
That's huge what you're saying there, Stephen, because
Mm.
with sepsis, it gallops along. The early signs are so weird, like they're more delirium and things like that you would not associate with quote unquote an infection.
Yeah.
And yet, just imagine, forgive me, sorry, and the treatments for sepsis are not, let's say, optimal.
No.
There was Paul Marek trying to use his TAP therapy. That's thiamine, ascorbic acid, and prednisone. Knocked on the head, if you like, by Monash University, or poo-pooed by it. But nobody is looking, certainly in the Orthodox world, about changing or treating the gut. Just imagine if people presenting early enough with sepsis were treated with quite innocuous things given orally, like, I'm going to say it, this serum bovine immunoglobulin complex, which I love, or probiotics like Saccharomyces boulardii, or,
Yeah.
Lactobacillus coagulans, whatever,
Mm.
rhamnosus, LGG, whatever.
Yeah.
Imagine if orthodox therapists started to embrace this in a hospital situation.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And, just, and again, to the lay person, or maybe even practitioners and people in healthcare, it's just a subtle use of language for me. I
Wow.
think it's important, but it's like, sepsis isn't just an overnight random event of a bacterial invasion. It's like there was a sequence of events leading up to that. It's
Yeah.
yes, once they got
Wow.
in that to that degree, cool. You're going to need the damage control level of, you know, acute emergency treatment. But yeah, there's this huge in between gap, but even like I was reading a paper, 2024 paper this year, August, in OncoTarget, Cancer Journal, talking about how in post-operative patients treated for colorectal cancer, it discussed the importance of gut barrier integrity in preventing bacterial LPS endotoxin translocation into circulation after surgery, because they're acknowledging that due to the damage to the gut barrier post-surgery, if that gut wall is still quite permeable, it's the translocation of LPS compounds, which increases their risk of local bowel and systemic cancers post-surgically in the future. So I thought that was really cool to read, that they're looking at that. And LPS because of this TLR4 activation pathway and the subsequent immune and inflammatory events. I mean, if you just Google PubMed, a type of cancer, LPS endotoxemia, all of them are being connected to this. Like, it's starting to be acknowledged. Whether it's prostate or colorectal. Like Helicobacter and the risk of gastric tumors is a classic example as well. But yeah, so once we understand that pathway, it's like, okay, cool. How does this relate to metabolic issues, with atherosclerosis, obesity, type 2 diabetes? The atherosclerosis one is a really interesting one, because, when LPS is essentially transported from the lumen into circulation via chylomicrons, right? And there are different sizes of all these lipoproteins, right? You got LDL, VLDL, small dense LDL, and LPS combined to all of them. And, so the ability of the lipoproteins to bind to LPS, again, the body does everything very intentionally. That binding of LDL to LPS is considered protective. The LDLs are trying to prevent sepsis. They're like, oh shit, there's LPS in the system, bind to that, get it, recycle it through the liver and get it out. The issue, and in studies, this is partly how statins appear to work too, because statins increase LDL receptors, which increases recycling of LDL and LPS from circulation. The issue, though, is that, not all lipoproteins get recycled. The smaller, denser LDL particles don't get recycled, so LPS remains in circulation. And so it's like, okay, well, what happens then? Again, we go back to this kind of TLR4 activation. So the LPS triggers the innate immune system, and that forms a foam cell like soft plaque at the endothelium, and that is the beginning of atherosclerosis.
This is so interesting.
Well, it's a huge topic.
Stephen, it's a massive topic. Can I ask though, at some stage we're talking about interventions, right? So when do you intervene with, you mentioned it, partially hydrogenated guar gum, PHGG.
Yeah.
Probiotics, we've spoken about the bovine serum immunoglobulins.
Yes.
When do you institute those things that heal the gut versus other things like, NAC, calcium D-glucarate, other detox regimens, liver gallbladder herbs that might clear toxins? Do you work on obviously stress and psychology in that first, diet, and then what comes in? Soothe the gut.
Yeah.
When do you start clearing?
Yeah, look, I do begin immediately. Pretty much these days, assuming, again, this safely assuming there's a degree of this permeability to deal with, and everyone's got a bit of dysbiosis going on in the end from all the testing I do. Everyone gets a very high dose of a, purified third-party tested omega-3. That's really important. There's research on the omega-3 for, reducing LPS translocation and a dampening of TLR4 signaling, and it's, crucial for the nervous system. So the omega-3 is up there. The bovine-derived immunoglobulins is a really nice one I'll use at the beginning for some people. Or once that result's back confirming things, it's really nice to, again, come in with that, initial damage control, like, okay, we've got to get this inflammatory load down as soon as possible by trying to neutralize and clear LPS, like to start that process. So the immunoglobulins are really good for that, as is the fish oil. As is, prebiotics, right? Particularly the polyphenol variety, let's call it, right? So, they act as prebiotics, so to speak. So,
yes.
Like dietary, all our kind of like rich colored plants, so to speak. Pomegranate is a pretty incredible one. May sneak that into someone initially, but if not, always, like pretty much everyone gets pomegranate for a variety of reasons. But in the context of LPS endotoxemia, for example, there is a really cool human trial. It's a randomized controlled trial, pomegranate polyphenols given to overweight and obese people with hyperlipidemia over 3 weeks. And it showed a significant decrease in plasma LPS, binding protein, CRP, while increasing butyrate producing bacteria and decreasing pro-inflammatory organisms like Methanobrevibacter. So polyphenols, particularly pomegranate, are kind of like the ultimate intervention for reducing LPS load, likely via feeding bacteria that reduce gut inflammation and heal a leaky gut, and decreasing the bacteria that are perpetuating that issue. Pommy, soil, the immunoglobulins. Look, some people I will get them straight onto a curcumin just because it's the research on that for reducing gut inflammation and for permeable gut is just pretty awesome too.
Yeah, cool. And sorry, I mentioned things like, your calcium D-glucarates, your NACs, your clearers, your phase 2s.
Yes.
Can you give us a dose guesstimate, a dosing range that you might use? And perhaps if you might, start off a little bit sheepishly in some people?
Yeah. So to your point there, like something I haven't mentioned I should have is when we're getting a bunch of testing done, I make everyone do an at-home transit test, right? So they consume corn or sesame seeds first thing in the morning, write down what time they did that and what time they first see it in their toilet bowl. Because bowel movements, observation of bowel movements are notoriously not reliable to tell for someone to say whether or not they're constipated, so to speak. And having optimal transit time between 16 and 24 hours is crucial, because otherwise you're reabsorbing compounds, right? And that dramatically perpetuates and worsens a leaky gut LPS issue. So in that context, hence it's kind of another win for PHGG, but in that context, particularly in a female who has super obvious relative estrogen excess issues, I will very regularly put them on calcium D-glucarate to help the liver and the gut along. That I'm usually doing like it's about 1,000 milligram dose, kind of higher end dose, but that works so well. And NAC does have some very cool research on reducing kind of LPS endotoxin load and helping with tight junction protein regulation. That, and we know it has, again, that one I might pull out, particularly if on top of the gut issues, I've got a client who has got some pretty intense nervous system dysregulation and, anxiousness, and because of its kind of glutamate modulating kind of properties. You only need about 600 milligrams a day of that, I find. It seems to do the job, and it's super cheap. So so many options to support all this, right? This really depends on the person.
Oh, yeah. Diabetes. Let's move on to that. Disorders. Diabetes is so huge. You were talking about somebody, I think was it you talking about somebody with polycystic ovarian syndrome? No,
Yes.
you were talking about women with estrogen problems. That was it. That was your wording. Yeah. So can we talk about that hormonal regulation then?
Yeah. So with addressing insulin resistance, like anything, there's many factors to consider, right? Like sleep, diet, macronutrient stress deficiencies, etc. But I do see a lot of women with PCOS and people on a weight loss journey and many things. And typically, I wouldn't say most of those people have a chronic gut issue at the same time, so they're not thinking about leaky gut. But the research is pretty strong on this point that metabolic endotoxemia may actually be the primary insult beginning the pathogenesis of something like type 2 diabetes due to its effects on insulin resistance, right?
Wow.
So I think it's like the American Diabetic Association have been researching this since like 2007. And in this paper, first of all, they showed if you took that CD14 innate immune system protein out, mice with it, injected with LPS didn't have any immune activation, right? So just kind of clarifies one of the mechanisms. But again, once this TLR4 activation occurs due to excessive LPS, there's so many mechanisms to back up that LPS may be the primary insult, like the TLR4 activation reduces insulin sensitivity by inhibiting insulin receptor activities, and the inflammatory cytokines increase liver glucose production and subsequent chronic inflammation. It decreases GLUT4 translocation, which prevents proper glucose uptake. So this idea that the metabolic endotoxemia piece is what begins to make someone not so sensitive to insulin is compelling, because there's this big question when we talk about all this, like, well, was it chicken or the egg, right? Who knows? Maybe it's different depending on the person. But I think at the end of the day, because of the TLR4 activation induced by LPS endotoxicity, it needs to be considered. And I think is a really smart approach to, say, reducing insulin sensitivity in people who, whether it's PCOS or obesity right? It does, it's not really going to change my approach. And, with obesity as well, there's interesting research on that, many people, I know association isn't causation, but in studies, they do observe people with obesity have much significantly higher populations of the LPS producing bacteria, gram-negative bacteria. And once there is, what the research shows, like particularly on like the effects of diet on LPS endotoxemia, is that if you give a quote-unquote normal weight versus an overweight individual a very endotoxic meal, so very high in, say, processed saturated fats and refined sugars, they both have a very similar endotoxic response. But if you give that same meal to an obese person, their endotoxic response is significantly more toxic. So it's kind of like once someone is obese, and because the TLR4 activation that's on overdrives kind of perpetuates fat storage and increases inflammatory cytokines, then an obese person's endotoxic response to food is a lot stronger. So taking an approach of investigating and addressing metabolic endotoxemia in that patient group is really important. And yeah, like really educating people on how to reduce and, a strong endotoxic response in their diet. And again, there's this question of what came first, a higher endotoxic response to food due to being obese, or was it, weight gain due to high metabolic endotoxic responses to food? And, I mean, you could argue on both sides, but there's some interesting research suggesting the metabolic endotoxemia preceded the obesity, just based on studies showing that people who had more potent endotoxic responses to food had a significantly increased risk of developing diabetes and obesity down the track. So, are some individuals pre-programmed with a certain microbiome to have more significantly endotoxic responses to food and therefore be at higher risk of developing metabolic issues, is the argument.
Stephen, can I ask, just to give us an overview of, I mean, this would be an overview of your mind, obviously, but give us an overview of what sort of journey these patients have. If you can just try and think about a few patients that you've treated recently around this concept of metabolic endotoxemia, can you give us an example of how they improve over time? What sort of conditions you've treated?
Yeah, look, I do see a lot of endometriosis. And so, for example, if I can think of some people recently, and these clients, especially with endo, they're not well. They're in a lot of pain and distress, and they're desperately seeking solutions, right? And so they're absolutely a group who, while I'm bagging on about treating the cause, I want to get them some symptom relief ASAP, right? That's where with these people, I love me some PEA. And yeah, it's similar. I guess similar to the story what I was trying to say earlier. It's like, because people are so unwell and really want a solution and find out about this link with the gut. Again, a lot of these clients come in very focused on the gut, and I make sure I explain to people really well, yes, we're going to treat your gut, but treating that actually requires us to zoom out and really support your overall health too. It's not just going to be a gut protocol or probiotics. And it's a mix, some people that really hits home and they get it, and they're up for it, looking at their overall kind of life and health and the sleep and the stress and all the things, and others not so much. But I'd say the overwhelming majority of people, once you get that point across, they get it. And, their treatments are similar in some ways and different in others, just depending. But yeah, look, endo, I have really good results. I don't know why. It's just once you and they all, for example, because endo has this big link with histamine as well, right? It's like, cool, here's a low histamine diet. It'll give you some relief, but it's not a solution. So with the histamine conversation, everyone's like, oh, I want to find out if I've got histamine bacteria in my gut. Honestly, 90% of them don't. But 90% of them do have, like, in my experience, significant overgrowths of E. coli, right? Kind of classic LPS producing microorganisms. So I don't know, with endo, I find if you really get on top of that endotoxemia and, get gut-centric and cool, reduce E. coli populations and all that kind of thing, like they get significantly better.
Can I ask,
Yeah.
what dose of PEA do you use?
I'll go pretty high for the first month, like about 600 milligrams twice a day for a month. And then ideally reduce that back to a 300 to 600 maintenance dose. But awesome for pain relief, right? Because and when someone's in that degree of pain, it's like they don't care about the multiple variables of dysbiosis that they need to address over, years. Just like yes, but we need to get people's symptom relief. So the PEA is pretty incredible for that. Like, yeah.
And do they take the PEA every day through their cycle, or just when they're experiencing pain?
No, I get them every day.
Every day.
Yeah. Yeah, most people need that.
It's such a huge issue. So undertreated, poorly managed, poorly diagnosed. It's a travesty of
Yeah,
mess.
I mean,
Really
when we
is.
talk about medications and okay, what contributes to leaky gut dysbiosis and LPS? Okay, what medications? The anti-inflammatories are shocking. They are very well known to perpetuate. Okay, well, what actually leads to these bacterial population balances in a leaky gut wall? Some people are surviving on those meds, and it's like cool.
Yes,
we have some good alternatives.
In desperation, I've seen one woman taking the high dose ibuprofen, that's the 400 milligram tablets, just popping them all day, trying to get relief because there was she couldn't get relief from a doctor who was hesitant about using opioids, and so she was popping these ibuprofen during the day and had a gastric bleed.
Yeah.
So she was done either way.
Yeah. And, again, a lot of this comes down to lifestyle and diet and, what's the saying? Outcomes are generated by habits. But most, people in chronic pain, that they know what they need to do, but they can't deal with it, So the symptom relief is really important at the beginning, right? That's what's the challenge about being a clinician. It's like, cool, we want to treat the cause, but we also want to, get you feeling better as soon as possible, without ignoring the root cause. So PEA is just a total winner for that.
And also, I have to ask about omega-3 fish oil. You said that you put a decent dose in. What dose do you use?
Usually I'm using fish oil with a very high ratio of EPA to DHA. So if someone's pretty inflamed, some pretty serious gut nervous system issues, I'll go about 2 to 3 grams total omega-3, with about a 3-to-1 ratio of EPA DHA. I go pretty high dose with that. They may not need to take that much forever, but again, just to get as much impact on that inflammation and endotoxemic stuff ASAP. Really high dose fish oil to begin with is very helpful.
Beautiful. We've learned so much from you, Stephen. Just one last quick question. Where can we learn more? Now, you've given us some great papers throughout this. I hope we're going to be putting these up on the website and in the show notes. We'll definitely do that, not I hope. Anything else? Any other seminal works? Have you got any courses, for instance?
No, they're in the works. Because I've been talking a lot in this chat about, symptom relief and damage control treatments for LPS, but there's a much bigger picture to consider, right? That's kind of what I'm in the process of developing a course on, because it's not sustainable for me or clients, like legit time or money, to get through all of what are the things I have to consider to figure that all out in appointments. It's just not sustainable for anyone. So, and I'm a bit all or nothing. So, I don't want to. I'm going to make something which kind of covers everything, all these variables, and here's the phases to go through, and that is in the works. It'll be out eventually. But
I
until
look
that's
forward to that mind map.
oh my gosh, it's been a process. Um, but yeah, so until that is out, you can just find me rambling on my Instagram, Stephen Judge
Yeah,
Naturopath on
beautiful.
my website. Yeah,
I love your work, Stephen. I love your mind. And I love that you don't just focusing on the problem at hand, but look at what's causing the problem. You can see it's pretty evident that you've got a lot of love and care that you give to your patients, and it's not just in about a little bit of poking it with a symptom relief. You really want to get them well. You want to get them vital. I really applaud you and what you do. Thank you so much for your work.
no worries, Andrew. It's a really cool chat.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to be putting up a heap of information for you in the show notes. And remember, you can catch up on all the other podcasts on the Designs for Health website. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. This is Wellness by Designs.